Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome. We're back once again, Access to Democracy. As usual, I'm your host, Alan Miller, and we have two return guests, both of whom thought that they would be vacationing here on June 3rd. Two legislators who instead are waiting for a special session to be called, which is why we're titling today's topic, The Legislative Mess. And I'm happy to have back the minority leader of the Minnesota House, Representative Erin Murphy, and
one of the minority leaders.
One of the minority leaders.
An assistant.
But my leader. So, and she's from District 64A, was here earlier this year with great trepidation about what was going to happen in this session. And then our other guest, Representative Joe Atkins from 39B, is a clairvoyant, because Joe first appeared in June 2003 as Governor Pawlenty was first taking office, and he said, if we follow this man's policies, this state is going to end up in a tremendous fiscal mess. Well, prescient that remark was, and the mess is what we're in.
I wish I'd been wrong.
We just finished a non-session. In effect, we face a shutdown. What do you both think about the possibility of a shutdown based on what we're hearing?
I think I think that the majority in the House and the Senate, the Republicans, are pretty dug in on their position, and until they feel the pressure from Minnesotans. And that pressure coming from Minnesotans very unhappy that we haven't finished our work and very unhappy that the government is shut down. I don't think that they're going to be willing to make a compromise to put forth a budget that's balanced, in a balanced way.
Well, I'm the eternal optimist. I think when you get enough Minnesotans together, Democrats, Republicans, doesn't matter, but if we sit down and Governor Dayton earlier today even invited to go to mediation, invite a nonpartisan mediator and try to bring the two sides together.
But they said no.
They said no, but
then he said two mediators,
and
they said no.
It's July 1st, though, is when we'd be talking about the potential for a shutdown. And that gives us a full month. We're actually not very far apart. You've got two different, the Republicans are proposing a property tax increase to solve the deficit. Democrats are proposing, Governor Dayton is proposing an income tax increase. That's the fundamental difference.
Property an income tax increase on the top 2% of earners.
Roughly
in the
people
state.
Making $300,000 or more.
Not people basically who we call the middle class.
Right.
They won't necessarily be hit. It's the people who can afford it best who are asking to give a little bit more, and we're talking about raising over $1 billion that way.
Well, it depends, Alan, on whose property tax increase or whose tax increase you're talking about. The Republican tax increase hits property taxes across the state. On a typical middle-class family, it's about $716. The Governor Dayton's proposal for an income tax increase hits those people making a little over $300,000 a year to about the same amount. It's like $725. So it's really, that's kind of the struggle and the difference between the two proposals. The Republicans have a same or similar tax increase of about $1.3 billion, and Governor Dayton's would raise about $1.8 billion.
I don't see it as the same. I see it as one entrenched, inflexible, ideological, fanatic group. I'm not partisan.
Not at all.
Trying to protect a small minority at the expense of the middle class, without thinking about health care, without thinking about the cost to higher education, without thinking about all the things that will suffer. And I was just talking with the Attorney General a few days ago. She said if we have a shutdown, it's going to cost this state $1 billion a week. $1 billion a week, to say nothing of all the businesses that will be hurt. Nothing to say of all the reservations that will be canceled at our tourism spots. So that's a tremendous blow to an already staggering economy.
It is. I think the ramifications for families and for individuals, for people who will be without work and without a paycheck, and for the slowly recovering economy are enormous. And I hope legislators and the governor are all thinking about that. I know that I am. That going to shutdown is going to be very costly for us in the short term and in the long term. It'll make the recovery that much harder. And I hope that we don't have to get to that point. But I think, Joe made an important point. The Republicans don't want to talk about the ramifications of their budget proposal and the tax increase that comes with that. They just want to talk about the simple number, $34 billion. And they don't want to talk about the impact of the cuts, what those cost people, especially middle-class families. They just want to talk about no new taxes and then close their eyes to the fact that they really are causing a tax increase, and a very costly tax increase for working middle-class families across the state of Minnesota. There is a really clear difference, and we're not that far apart in the math. But until they're able to reconcile the impact of their budget proposal, they're not going to have, I think, a clear path to a compromise.
And that's really what endangers us and endangers the quality of life that we have. We saw under this no new taxes philosophy, property taxes go up. School levies imposed. Who did they hit? They hit the same people, the people who can least afford it in many cases. And it certainly did not help our economy at all. At a time when I know Pawlenty talked initially about jobs. Well, were thousands of jobs, tens of thousands of jobs created under Governor Pawlenty? I think not. That's the same thing that we're going through in the federal government. They talk jobs, 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 and we come up with, let's not let gays get married. One of the big issues of this session.
One of the big issues. That was the only issue, Alan. That was the unfortunate part about this session. We went in with the majority in the House and Senate talking about this is going to be about creating jobs and it's going to be about dealing with the deficit. We didn't do either one of those. In fact, the only jobs bill turned out to be the Surly bill. Surly Brewing wants to add on, and the chief author of that happened to be a Democrat. I know that because it was me. That was literally
and that bill was passed.
It was the only jobs bill that passed, and we're sitting here. We still haven't addressed the $5 billion deficit. The only thing that legitimately got accomplished under the leadership in the House and Senate is that we're going to put gay marriage on the ballot in 2012. And regardless of
As
how you
a constitutional amendment.
regardless of how you feel about that issue, because people feel strongly, but we could have done that in 2012. This session was supposed to be about dealing with the deficit and creating jobs, and we didn't do either one.
And the fact of the matter is, the governor proposed a bond issue, which was pushed off until next session. They wouldn't bring it up. A bond issue where we get money at the cheapest interest rate to work on our infrastructure, which is in desperate need of working on it. As I said, maybe the last time you were here, there was a pothole in Minneapolis that's so large that there's a drugstore at the bottom of it. I stole that line from David Letterman. But the fact of the matter is, we could have created thousands of jobs with a bond issue at the cheapest interest rates possible. They wouldn't even consider it this semester, but spent weeks on this gay marriage issue. And frankly, I just don't know of anybody who feels threatened by whether two gays are in a union or whether they marry or, you know, whatever. I mean, to me, that's a non-issue.
Well, I think we experienced in those the days running up to the vote on that constitutional amendment, the intensity that Minnesotans are going to feel over the next 18 months as there's a campaign waged on either side of that question. There were people in the Capitol protesting day after day, both sides of the issue. There are strong feelings. It is very divisive. We had state troopers present in the Capitol serving as protection for not only legislators but for citizens for the first time ever. You know, the debate, if you will call it a debate, because it was mostly my colleagues in the Democratic caucus that spoke out on the issue. The debate
And one very brave Republican.
Yes. Well, there were three actually, two who spoke out against it. But the debate itself, I think, essentially broke the session. The days that followed that then were very unproductive, and you could feel the tension gone in any sort of move to resolve the budget deficit. It was just done. I think it was divisive for the legislature itself.
And for instance, in this district, we're now represented by Representative Wardlow. And he was dead set against gays being able to marry. I wanted to get him on the program here and asked him about the fact that he divorced and remarried, and isn't that as much a danger to our society as having gays get married? But unfortunately, Representative Wardlow chooses not to come on to Access to Democracy to answer that and some other questions. So,
well, I don't think the question is really about marriage. It is an anti-gay discriminatory action. It's about trying to define who we love and how we love them. And I don't think there's room in the Constitution for that question.
And unfortunately, if these people are as religious who are in opposition as they pretend to be, and if they read some of the New Testament, I don't see how they can reconcile their position. But moving on, there was a poll yesterday that 63% of the state, of the people polled, support the governor's position. That's pretty awesome amount of people, but it doesn't seem to be getting through to Amy Koch or Representative Zellers.
Not yet.
I think they've given sort of the indication they don't want to compromise. And it does take two, like it takes two to tango, it takes two to compromise. And thus far, I give the governor a great deal of credit. He's come a long way, much further than I ever anticipated he would, because he's come down. In fact, now the proposed spending increase that he is proposing is 1.8% annually, which matches inflation. And he started out considerably higher than that. He started out with roughly twice the proposed tax increase that he has now. He's come an awfully long way, much further than I anticipated that he would. And it's gotten to the point now, though, where you've gotten down to the toughest cuts. If we don't have that revenue increase, that basically the inflationary cost, that'll result in the highest cut to higher education that we've ever seen. It'll result in 145,000 working Minnesotans losing their health care. It'll result in winners and losers in our school districts, and more of what you talked about earlier with property tax increases, a $1.3 billion property tax increase across the state of Minnesota. That's the fundamental difference. And the fact is that the leadership in the House and Senate, the Republican leadership has said they're just not willing to compromise. And unfortunately, we're now looking at a shutdown in roughly 3 weeks. that I really don't believe needs to occur, but they've got a number of their members. The worst thing about it, Alan, is that some of their members have openly said they would welcome a shutdown. And not only, Aaron talked earlier about the impact on those individual state employees and their families. Think about all the businesses and all the individuals. You go to renew a license, you need an inspection in order to get a permit. All the things that we rely on that are going to be there, just as a small business owner, and I saw some of the factoids that you have about me. Mainly, when you said I was going on vacation, or I expected to be on vacation at this time, I just go back to work, where I go every day before the legislative session starts. I practice law in South St. Paul, and if I can't go to the courts and have the doors be open, it's hard to get justice for people. If I can't get my legal license renewed, if a realtor can't get their license, if you can't get an inspection done. We're talking about, I think it's 30,000 private sector jobs that will be cut under the Republican budget.
How about the state parks? How about shutting down our state parks, not only putting out thousands of people out of work, but cutting off the revenue that is... I didn't realize that the revenue that we get from tourism in the state equals the revenue that we get from agriculture. Those are our two biggest revenue sources. We would just take one and close it off. Why? To protect, I think, 2,000 people who haven't indicated that they're unwilling to pay a little bit more, which is really a very sore point with me.
I represent a lot of folks that are in that 2%. In my legislative district, I have part of Invergrove Heights, South St. Paul, and Sunfish Lake. And there's 689 families that fall into that category. I probably talked to about 60 now that are in that $300,000 plus range. 2 have objected. One had actually done the math and said it's about the cost of a latte a day was the impact on his family.
A latte a day.
A latte a day. It was going to cost him, he figured, about $1,500 to $2,000.
Switch to regular coffee.
Well, regardless, he likes lattes, okay? But, and he said, for the benefits that we get in Minnesota, and he talked about college, that the fact that the folks that he employs, just like my 8 employees, the reason we're in Minnesota is not only our families here, but because you can get great employees here in Minnesota. And it's the educated workforce that you have here in Minnesota. The cost of a latte a day versus the sort of benefits that we have in Minnesota, for all the people that all but 2 have said, absolutely, it said nothing tax increase for me relative to the sort of benefits that I have of having my business here in Minnesota.
And the fact of the matter is that we have more per capita, 50 of the best corporations, the top 500 corporations in this state. The University of Minnesota Medical School in particular, as now we have this E. coli outbreak in Europe, who do they call? They call experts from the University of Minnesota, which is one of the top areas or the top fields for those experts. Those people are not going to stay here. We've already lost some research people. We have already lost and diminished the quality of our education in higher education. And we're seeing it happen. And I just wrote an article in which I said Minnesota will soon be spelled Mississippi. But I see that coming. And it's not why anybody lives in Minnesota, which has such a proud tradition and heritage.
Well, that point can't be emphasized enough. We're literally talking about the biggest cut to colleges and universities in the history of the state of Minnesota since 1858. What the Republicans are talking about in their budget, on which they refuse to compromise thus far, is the biggest cut to higher education in Minnesota's history. These are, historic kinds of cuts that we're talking about, and so it's just fundamental differences between the two positions. But the one point that we can't overemphasize is the fact that we're talking about 2 tax increases. Governor Dayton talking about an income tax increase based on your ability to pay. Republicans talking about a property tax increase, a $1.3 billion property tax increase, which is part of their budget. from nonpartisan staff, by the way. This
Right.
isn't Representative Murphy and Atkins, two Democrats. This is from nonpartisan folks who've confirmed it's a $1.3 billion property tax increase from the Republicans. That's the least fair way to tax people.
But there were other issues that were taken up, important issues. Abortion and taking away women's rights to control their body, a tax on abortion, making it more restrictive, making guns easier for people. Well, they can possess them easily now, but now you can shoot first. If you see a kid coming onto your property to retrieve a ball that fell onto your property, shoot him and ask questions later. I think they pulled that bill at the...
They haven't made,
they
we've
didn't
heard
bring
it
it to
in-
the floor.
Right, there you go.
Racino, do we need Racino or no Racino? Let's take more away from the Indians. As it is, we took the country away from them and put them on reservations, so let's take away their ability to help themselves.
Well, and now let's, we should be careful here because we have, like with Republicans, you have Republicans on both sides of those issues. You have Democrats on both sides of those issues. I think the best point that you're making, though, is a matter of priorities. The priorities should have been on creating jobs and dealing with the deficit. And what we spent was 5 months doing anything but dealing with the deficit and creating jobs, other than the Surly bill, of course.
And if we had spent our time really wrestling with the budget and really balancing it, we wouldn't have had time to do those other issues.
But you didn't even have the opportunity to do that. The way I see the legislature
That was the
was structured,
most frustrating
that you
piece of it.
couldn't do it. You couldn't even get your voice heard in these committees.
Well, we don't set we're in the minority and we understand that. So we don't get to set the agenda.
I hope the people
Republicans set
understand
the
that
agenda.
also. And of course, if 145,000 more people go off of health care, where does that cost go? It goes right into emergency rooms,
Right.
other than the fact that a lot of people will die because they can't get medications and things like that, into emergency rooms where the costs are 10 times as great.
Well, I think, we know that the costs will be spread out, and everybody will pick up that hidden tax. But when you look at the amount that they're proposing to cut in Health and Human Services, and you match that with the federal dollars we will lose, it's about $3.3 billion coming out of healthcare. And that'll reach into everybody's experience in healthcare. We don't have intensive care unit beds for middle-class families with private health insurance and intensive care unit beds for poor people. We just have a limited number of intensive care unit beds. And if hospitals, lose that much funding, we're going to have fewer intensive care unit beds for everybody in Minnesota. So it's going to impact everybody's access. It's going to impact everybody's cost.
We can set up tent hospitals, which in
Nash
January and February in Minnesota would be very successful. It's interesting to me because the Republicans, when they were attacking Obama's health care proposals, which I refuse to call Obamacare because it's not, it's national health care, they talked about putting grandma out to die. But this is literally putting people out to die. And another thing that they're proposing is slashing transit to the point where costs are going to go up prohibitively. Who suffers the most? Who uses mass transit the most? People who need buses because they can't afford cars, especially at a time when gasoline was at $4 and is just a little bit less than $4 a gallon. These, again, are the people who can least bear the burden, who get hit the hardest.
Right.
And it just seems to me to be unconscionable that you could possibly look yourself in the mirror every morning and not see a ghoulish person on the other side of the mirror.
If we can return to healthcare for just a moment.
Sure.
The most infuriating point in the session came when as part of the national healthcare, there's a proposal that each state is supposed to adopt an insurance exchange. Sounds like a fancy title. All it means, though, is you can basically go to a competitive marketplace to buy your health insurance. As a small business person, I pray for the day when I can actually pick and choose between and do some comparison shopping. It's the single biggest, most increasing expense that we have as a small business. And Representative Murphy was one of the leaders trying to bring about an insurance exchange which was proposed, I might add, originally by Republicans. Mitt Romney and others led the charge for a competitive marketplace for health insurance. Republicans beat it down. They voted, I believe it was unanimously, against establishing an insurance exchange here in Minnesota. The Minnesota Chamber of Commerce's top healthcare priority was establishment of a healthcare exchange. And the Tea Party folks and the Twyla Braces of the world, and they were pulling the leash on the Republicans in such a harsh way that they actually got them to stymie that whole discussion. So we go another year without a competitive marketplace for health insurance, something that could save small businesses and individuals hundreds or thousands of dollars a year. And they chose to just vote it down.
And we hear so much about protecting small business from the Republicans when in fact they turn their back on small business with situations like this, situations like the taxes that will be imposed of necessity to keep the state functioning, to say nothing of what's going to happen if there's a shutdown. I mean, to me, it's just shameful. And I don't know why we don't have single payer in this country like every other civilized country. Well, I do know why, as long as there are HMOs and insurance companies and people with lobbyists who not only write the legislation, but give tremendous campaign contributions to the people who control those laws. But to me, that's criminal. And so we have 2 minutes left. In conclusion, what are your hopes, prayers?
I hope that we all listen closely to Minnesotans and that we choose to lead on behalf of Minnesotans. As Representative Atkins said, he represents a lot of people who would be in that fortunate few who would contribute on the income tax proposed by the governor. I do too. And I'm not convinced that they are looking for the protection that the Republicans are offering them. And I sometimes think the Republicans are very busy protecting their brand and their party ideology more than they are looking out for Minnesotans and their future. So I hope that Minnesotans speak up, and I hope that we all listen closely so that we get a budget passed that moves us forward together as a people.
And Joe?
Amen. I think we're awfully close.
And I think these people have to realize that there is another election in 2012, which is not that far away. And the people whose memories may not be that long will remember until then. Of course, that's assuming that voter ID and other things don't keep away minorities and students and soldiers and people who are absentee voters and things like that, which is another thing the Republicans are trying to do. Mm-hmm. But I want to thank you both for venting my frustration on you, Representative Erin Murphy and Representative Joe Atkins. And
thank you for having me.
Joe, congratulations for lasting 8 years on this show.
I started out with dark hair. I think I'm all gray hair now. But
thanks so much, and come back soon.
Thank you.
Will do. Thank you.